Imagine a country unveiling a project so big it could change the map of East Africa forever. A deep water port to rival the busiest in the world. High-speed trains rushing across thousands of kilometers. Oil pipelines reaching the sea. And entire cities rising from empty land. It was called the Lapset Corridor, and it carried a $25 billion price tag. At its launch, leaders promised it would rewrite the story of trade in Africa. But years later, much of it lies incomplete. Some parts abandoned, and the dream has turned into a painful reminder of how bold visions can collapse midway. So, how did this happen? The idea of the Lamu Port South Sudan-Ethiopia transport corridor wasn't just about roads and rails. It was sold as a new economic lifeline that would lift entire regions out of isolation. At its center was Lamu Port, a futuristic harbor carved out of the Indian Ocean, planned with 23 berths deep enough to welcome the world's largest cargo ships. Alongside it, Bloomberg noted that a 1,720-kilometer railway was to snake through Kenya's remote north, linking Addis Ababa in Ethiopia and Juba in South Sudan. Oil pipelines were mapped to run straight to the coast. Airports in once-forgotten towns were to become international gateways. Even luxury resort cities were promised, designed to attract tourism and investors to corners of the continent long ignored. In speeches, it sounded unstoppable. The plan wasn't just to build infrastructure, but to rewrite East Africa's economy. Mombasa Port, already stretched and congested, was no longer enough. Traders were waiting days for containers. Ships were lining up at sea, and businesses were paying the price. Lapset was meant to be the solution. It was meant to open up regions like Isiolo and Turkana, giving people new jobs, better transport, and access to markets that had always felt far away. Supporters called it the New Silk Road for Africa. But while the blueprint was dazzling, reality was harsher. Big projects can capture imagination, but they are also fragile. The bigger the dream, the heavier the burden of making it real. And with Lapset, those burdens quickly started piling up. To understand why this project captured so much attention, you need to look at what came before it. For decades, the lifeline of East Africa was the port of Mombasa. It handled millions of containers every year, but the pressure was overwhelming. Cargo that should have cleared in a few days sat stuck for nearly a week. Paper forms dragged the process into weeks, while modern ports elsewhere cleared goods in half the time. Larger vessels avoided it altogether because the harbor was too shallow for megaships that dominate global trade. The frustration wasn't just about ships. It trickled down to every corner of daily life. Businesses couldn't move their goods on time. Ordinary people felt the ripple effect when prices of everyday items climbed higher. For landlocked neighbors like Ethiopia and South Sudan, relying on Mombasa alone was risky. They needed alternatives, and Kenya wanted to be the one to provide them. That's why Lapset mattered. It wasn't just a Kenyan dream. It was supposed to be a regional answer to a growing crisis. By building from scratch at Lamu, planners could design a port without the flaws of Mombasa. With a deep harbor, cutting-edge systems, and no backlog of old infrastructure, it promised speed and efficiency. Add the railway, highways, airports, and pipelines, and the corridor would have redefined how East Africa moved goods, people, and energy. But dreams, no matter how well drawn, face the test of execution. And as we'll see, execution was where Lapset began to stumble. If you're finding this story eye-opening, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. It keeps us digging deeper into megaprojects like this one, and you won't miss the next big breakdown. When construction finally broke ground, there was real excitement. For years, the corridor had been little more than blueprints and speeches. But in 2012, heavy machines appeared at Lamu's coastline. According to Offshore Energy, the government announced that this was the official start of the port, the centerpiece of the project. Local and international media covered the groundbreaking ceremony, framing it as the beginning of a new era for East Africa. 3 berths were prioritized, each capable of receiving ships carrying up to 100,000 tons of cargo. The cost alone was staggering, nearly $500 million. At the same time, roads were being carved out across Kenya's northern frontiers. The Isiolo-Moale Highway, a 505-kilometer stretch connecting Ethiopia, was completed, transforming a once dusty and dangerous route into a modern artery for trade. Airports in places like Isiolo were upgraded with new runways and terminals, and Menda Airport in Lamu extended its runway to handle larger planes. For communities that had always been cut off, this progress felt tangible. But even in these early days, challenges surfaced. Delays slowed the pace, costs rose, and the port's initial berths took longer than expected. By the time the first phase of Lamu Port was ready in 2021, nearly a decade had already passed since the launch. While the ribbon cutting brought a sense of hope, the project's early momentum was slower than its vision suggested. And the cracks in the timeline were already starting to show. To understand how big Lapset was meant to be, you have to look at the numbers. This wasn't a few roads and a port. It was a continent-shaping venture. The railway alone was projected to cost over $7 billion, with plans for passenger trains reaching 160 kilometers per hour and freight trains at 120 kilometers per hour. The port at Lamu carried a price tag of $3.5 billion, designed to sprawl across 400 hectares with 23 berths in total. The oil pipeline was estimated at $4 billion, and new resort cities in Isiolo, Lamu, and Lokichar came with an additional $1.2 billion each. Altogether, the project's budget stood at $25 billion. For Kenya, that was unprecedented. Funding would come from a mix of government contributions, regional support, and private investors eager for long-term returns. At least, that was the plan. The logic was clear: build once, reap for decades. With world-class infrastructure, Kenya could position itself as a trade hub, draw investment into untapped regions, and compete with rivals like Djibouti. But that level of ambition comes with a price: complex financing arrangements, fragile investor confidence, and pressure to keep the project moving despite setbacks. And as the years rolled on, keeping the money flowing became one of the corridor's biggest battles. The first hints of trouble came from investors themselves. Private backers who were supposed to cover much of the project's cost grew hesitant. Political instability in South Sudan, tensions in Ethiopia, and Kenya's own shifting leadership created uncertainty. Why sink billions into a corridor if the trade routes might shift elsewhere? Ethiopia, for example, was investing heavily in Djibouti and exploring Somaliland ports, raising doubts about how much traffic Lamu could actually attract. Meanwhile, local communities began voicing their frustrations. Farmers near Lamu worried about displacement without proper compensation. Fishermen warned that dredging the coastline was damaging their livelihoods. Environmental groups flagged the destruction of mangroves and grazing lands. What was meant to be a story of opportunity was starting to feel, for many on the ground, like a threat. Inside the project itself, cracks in planning appeared. Some environmental studies had been rushed, forcing redesigns. Coordination between government agencies was clumsy, with overlapping responsibilities slowing decisions. Corruption whispers began circulating, raising suspicion about inflated budgets and contracts. The shine of the original vision was still there in speeches, but on the ground, momentum was already weakening. The warning signs were clear. Without solid financing, community buy-in, and consistent leadership, the Lapset dream risked becoming another unfinished promise. One of the most damaging blows to Lapset was political inconsistency. The project was launched under President Mwai Kibaki as part of his Vision 2030 strategy, but once leadership changed, the focus shifted. Under President Uhuru Kenyatta, the corridor was repeatedly used as a campaign showcase. Every election cycle, promises were made that this time the port will be finished, or this time the railway will connect Addis Ababa and Juba. Instead of continuity, the project became a political prop. Each change in administration meant renegotiations, fresh approvals, and even redesigns. This slowed progress further and inflated costs. Ethiopia and South Sudan, both supposed partners, were struggling with their own leadership battles and conflicts, making them unreliable allies. South Sudan's civil war disrupted oil production, cutting off a major pillar of the pipeline plan. Ethiopia, while part of the vision, continued to expand its reliance on Djibouti, signaling less urgency to commit fully to Lapset. Instead of steady progress across multiple governments, the corridor suffered from being tied to whoever was in office. Without strong institutional backing, the vision could not outlive individual leaders. This leadership vacuum became a recurring weakness that slowed the project's momentum year after year. At the heart of the collapse was financing. From the beginning, the $25 billion figure was daunting. The plan relied heavily on private investors and public-private partnerships, but those arrangements quickly unraveled. Investors saw uncertainty, unstable regional politics, long timelines, and questionable returns. As private financing dried up, the Kenyan government tried to carry the burden. Funds were channeled through the exchequer and state agencies, but it was never enough. Inflation, fluctuating exchange rates, and rising import costs doubled the original estimates. Infrastructure materials stuck at ports during the COVID-19 pandemic added more delays and costs. China, which had heavily financed projects like the Standard Gauge Railway, was less interested in Lapset. They preferred the Ethiopian-Djibouti corridor, which was already functional. Other potential backers saw the risk of pouring money into a project with no guarantee of profitability. By the mid-2020s, Kenya alone could no longer sustain the financial weight. With a little external support, billions already spent, and critical phases still unfunded, money became the single biggest obstacle. Without consistent funding, the Grand Corridor was destined to stall. While funding and politics were crippling issues, resistance from local communities made things worse. Along the coast in Lamu, families were displaced to make way for the port, but many claimed they never received proper compensation. Farmers in Isiolo and Turkana watched as land was taken, often without clear agreements. Instead of new opportunities, many people felt robbed of their heritage. Fishing communities saw their waters disrupted by dredging. Mangroves, essential for marine life, were uprooted. Grazing routes for pastoralists were cut off, creating conflict over water and pasture. In many areas, resentment replaced excitement. Protesters blocked access roads, halting construction for weeks. Environmental groups also drew attention to how little consultation had been done before bulldozers arrived. To them, the project symbolized development imposed from the top down, ignoring the people living closest to the construction sites. The idea of progress was being delivered at a cost borne by those least able to resist. These human stories mattered. They shifted the project's image from a unifying regional dream to a source of division. What was supposed to connect people began tearing them apart, making it even harder for the project to sustain momentum. Even as Kenya tried to push the corridor forward, global and regional dynamics undercut its value. Ethiopia, one of the key beneficiaries, had quietly been deepening its ties with Djibouti. The Ethiopia-Djibouti Railway was already operational, offering a faster, safer, and more predictable trade route. For Ethiopia, it made more sense to expand something proven rather than gamble on an unfinished dream. At the same time, Somaliland's Berbera port and Sudan's Port Sudan were emerging as alternatives. Lapset was designed to give landlocked nations more options, but those very nations were hedging their bets elsewhere. Then came the pandemic. COVID-19 froze construction, stranded materials at ports, and forced governments to redirect budgets toward health and emergency needs. Projects like LabSet, already struggling with delays, sank further down the priority list. Costs ballooned as global supply chains tightened, making every shipment of steel or fuel more expensive. Meanwhile, other African regions were accelerating. The Central Corridor in Tanzania and the North-South Corridor in Southern Africa began attracting investment. LabSet, once pitched as a continental game-changer, was starting to look like the slowest horse in the race. By the time work resumed after the pandemic, the momentum was gone. Kenya was almost alone in carrying the financial and political weight. The neighbors it had hoped would be partners were more invested in other corridors. What began as a regional vision now looked like a Kenyan burden, and an unsustainable one at that. By the mid-2020s, the gap between vision and reality was impossible to ignore. Billions had been spent, but what stood on the ground told a very different story. At Lamu, 3 berths had been completed and a few roads were functional. Isiolo Airport had been expanded, and the Isiolo-Moale Highway to Ethiopia was working. But these were fragments of a much bigger promise. The railway, the oil pipeline, and the resort cities, some of the project's most ambitious features, remained on paper or frozen mid-plan. The financial taps had run dry. Investors no longer believed in the corridor, and government funds were stretched thin. Local resistance and environmental concerns had slowed progress further. Every year, deadlines were pushed, announcements grew vaguer, and the public grew more skeptical. To many Kenyans, LabSet became a symbol of broken promises, glossy brochures, and groundbreaking ceremonies that led nowhere. For Ethiopians and South Sudanese, it was an idea they once hoped for and eventually stopped counting on. The dream of a new African Silk Road had shrunk into isolated pieces of infrastructure that didn't connect into the powerful corridor they were meant to form. Instead of rewriting Africa's trade future, LabSet ended up as a cautionary tale, a $25 billion ambition that collapsed not with an explosion, but with a slow, painful fade into stalemate. The truth is, LabSet didn't collapse with a dramatic announcement. It faded piece by piece until the Grand Corridor was no longer recognizable as the $25 billion dream it once was. I actually booked my last trip to Cancun for half the usual price. And no, I'm not gatekeeping. I used Expedia, and I've dropped my affiliate link below so you can get the same deals. No extra cost to you, just real savings. I'm also really grateful for your time and attention. I spend hours digging through research and turning it into stories you can enjoy. If you'd like to support me, it would mean a lot. If you could buy me a coffee, it keeps me caffeinated and ready to keep making videos like this. And if you think this project was wild, wait until you hear about the next one, inside the $1 trillion smart city that might never be finished. A megacity so ambitious, it risks becoming the world's biggest unfinished project.